We're going to make just a few more comments about a disciple as an athlete before we move on and look at a disciple as a soldier. And I really wanted to bring this up, otherwise we would have just went ahead and moved on. But I felt so strongly about the point that this was making, it needs to be said again. So as everyone's kind of gotten in, Gene, would you mind leading us? Amen. Okay, the last element that we're going to talk about as far as the athlete is that they run to win. Okay, they run to win. So an athlete, and kind of continuing along with the metaphor, an athlete has to train, and then they show up and they compete. And that's pretty good. But what else do they have to do? They've got to win. They've got to run to win. Does that mean, every metaphor is really, really good, but all of them to an extent do tend to break down at certain points. Does that mean that I have to be a better Christian than anyone else? No. What does it mean, though? It does mean that I'm doing the absolute best that I can, which speaks to the fact that if you're going to be a Christian, then do what? Well, there's a lot of individual things you have to do, but generally speaking, if you're going to be a Christian, you need to what? Yeah, you need to be one. That exactly what you need to put your whole heart in it. Because what was the Lord's reaction to people who were lukewarm? It just isn't good enough. I mean, it's just not good enough. For someone to be here, just to be here, someone is, maybe they're just appeasing parents, maybe they're appeasing a spouse. All of us, with all of our collective years of experience, have seen all of it. A lot of times, of course, that happens with children, but with children, if we raise them well, not perfect, if we raise them well, they begin to develop faith in their own hearts, then they show up because they want to win. If not, they just are appeasers. And what ultimately happens to appeasers? More times than not, they fail. More times than not, they fail. Sometimes you'll keep them for a long, long period of time. They'll be here, but they won't what? They're not really here. They're not excelling in what can make someone a stronger child of God. And that's what we've got to do. So Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3, just noticing some of these verses before we move on. What does Hebrews 12, verse 3 tell us? Oh, I'm sorry, verse 1. I had 3 in my mind. What does verse 1 say? So I've got to lay aside every weight. I've got to throw off, I've got to throw out everything that hinders me. We also had brought up in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36, what had happened with them. Hebrews 10, verse 36, what point was made? They had to endure, exactly. They had to endure. So it wasn't, we gave the illustration between a 100-meter dash and a what? And a marathon, okay? In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24, run in such a way that you may what? That you may obtain a prize. In verse 26, notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 26, let's take a look at that. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and 26, what did Paul say there? I'm not just beating the air. I fight not as one who beats the air, but in verse 27, I what? Discipline, bring it into subjection so that I'm not going to be what? Disqualified. If you're going to do this, you need to what? You need to do it with all your heart. You need to finish it. If you're going to do that, there's no reason to be a Christian halfway. Because said another way, that's just being someone who's lukewarm. And what we already say that the Lord thinks about that. He doesn't look very highly on it. If you're going to do it, you need to do it. That's what a disciple does. And then lastly, Colossians chapter 3, 1 and 2, how do I help myself? I set my mind on the things above, where Christ is. And then lastly, in Philippians chapter 3 and 12 through 14, what did Paul say? Where does my energy go? My energy goes in pressing forward toward the goal, toward the prize. Paul had to look backward in his life and had to give up a lot in thinking about an athlete. What's an athlete got to do in order to discipline their body? They've got to give up what? A lot. What's an athlete have to give up? They have to give up time. They have to give up. What else? Right. Yeah. Some people have to give up themselves as far as being an athlete. You've got a kid who's a star football player in high school. They go to college and they're where? Kind of back down. They have to give up of themselves. They have to give up the things that they would want and that they would like to do because they've always got to what? They've got to practice. They've got to train. Being a disciple, the whole point of these series of lessons, being a disciple is a commitment. And the same thing is going to be true as we move into the concept of a soldier. A Christian is a soldier, but we've got to be very, very careful with this, especially in the last 25 years. Why do we have to be so careful about this? In how we say this? What's happened in the last 25 years? I mean, that's really more than 25 years, but 25 years is good enough to illustrate it. What happened in September 22 years ago? 9/11. And what did we find out about? We knew this beforehand, but what was graphically illustrated to everyone about people who were Muslims? Well, a small minority of people who were Muslims, nevertheless, who were Muslims, they believed that they had to what? Yes. I mean, when we talk about fighting, which we will, what did they really believe? You really had to what? You really had to fight. I mean, you really had to take a battle physically to people. So right off the bat, what point do we need to make about the disciple being a soldier? It's just a what? It's just a way to illustrate a very, very important point. It's a spiritual fight. But we need to kind of establish the fact. When people were in the Roman Empire, it was probably very common for them. Because our structure is different, we don't see people we don't see soldiers all of the time. Maybe if we lived in a different part of Texas, you would probably see it more. But most of us don't come in contact with that because we have a police force. But back in the Roman Empire, there wasn't that distinction. You just had Roman soldiers. So just like we see police all of the time, back then they saw soldiers all of the time. And as Paul is taking from that image there life circumstance and he's trying to say this is what a disciple is like, well, naturally, what would come to their mind? All of these characteristics that we're going to talk about. The first one of which is that we just simply have a commander. Let's go to 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 3 and 4. And these are really the passages where the whole idea of us being soldiers is really set in. 2 Timothy 2 and 3 and 4, what does it say?
This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth.
Okay, so 2 Timothy 2, 3 and 4.
Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him.
Okay, so when someone goes into the military, they're in it for how long? Till they're done. And that all just depends on how long it means to be done. But when they're in it, they're what? They're in it. When they're in it, they're in it. No one who's a good soldier does what in verse 4? Gets involved. Entangles himself. Entangles himself. I've had a lesson before. Are you entangled? You know, are you just caught up too much in stuff? Because a good soldier avoids that, so that they may please, look in verse 4, so that they may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And what's really interesting is that in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, it talks about Jesus. And what description does it use of Jesus in Hebrews 2, verse 10? Very interesting. He is the what? He's the captain of our salvation. And as a captain, captains can do what? They can give orders, and that's exactly what Jesus does. We've got these instances for illustrative purposes. Matthew chapter 8. So look in Matthew chapter 8, and let's look in verses 8 and 9. What does it say? Matthew 8, 8 and 9, drawing from the centurion. So the whole structure of this, I mean, we understand if you're under a commander and they say go, you go. Luke chapter 6, verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and what? And do not do not do the things that I say. So if you're, again, it's down to choices like I'd mentioned in the lesson. If you're going to be of the Lord, you're going to have to what? You're going to have to obey Him. I mean, you're going to have to do the things that He wants you to do. That's just, again, it's part and parcel of what it means to be a disciple. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24, noting in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, what does it say? Okay, so in my ability to deny myself, take up my cross, and follow me, who do I always have with me? Who's always with me? Right there. Christ is. Christ is. And especially the book of Hebrews is really, really good pointing this out. In Hebrews chapter 2, in the 18th verse, what does it tell us? Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 18. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18. And then when you've got Hebrews chapter 4, it says the same. Hebrews chapter 7, He always lives to what? Make intercession for us. So while I am being as a soldier asked to serve and be on duty, I also have what assurance from Christ? That He's always going to what? He's always going to be there with me. So first and foremost, we've got a commander. Secondly, we've got an enemy. Of course, who's our enemy? Satan is. And this is, so consistently spoken of. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. You guys answered this in the correct way earlier. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. What kind of a battle am I in? What kind of warfare am I in? What does Ephesians 6, verse 12 say? What did I say?
For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, and against the rulers of the darkness of the world, against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Did I say it wrong to begin with? What kind of battle are we in? A spiritual one. So the enemy is going to be the one that's going to lead a spiritual battle. So it's obviously going to be a spiritual enemy. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Who does that end up being? Satan. Revelation chapter 12, verse 3, just as a description. Revelation chapter 12, verse 3. So what do a lot of people think about Satan, do you believe? If you brought up the idea of Satan to people, what would they think? Yeah, a dragon with, or someone in red with horns in the tail. So it's just a what to them? What would you call that? A character, or even would go further, even a caricature. There's a lot of people who believe in God and have actually a pretty decent concept of God. It may be imperfect because they've not studied the Bible, but it's a decent understanding of God. But with Satan, what do they think? It's just, it might be more physical, or Satan's just kind of more of a, yeah, it's just kind of more of a joke. That was the word that was coming to me. It's just more kind of a joke. He's not serious. He's not real. Revelation 12, verse 3, though, has a startling description. Another sign appeared in heaven, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. Now, the 7 and the 10, that's got its own specific figurative meaning, which is we won't go into now. But he's presented as what? A very, what? A very terrifying, real being. A terrifying real being. That's what you've got in 1 Peter chapter 5. He's like a what? He's like in Revelation 12, 1 Peter chapter 5, he's like a roaring lion. Yeah, like a roaring lion. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 12 tells us, everything again down to decisions. So while we've got a great dragon with the heads and the horns and the crowns, at the very heart, he is a what? Everything is up to your decisions. So he must be a master what? Tempter. Or, think of John chapter 8, verse 44, a master deceiver. Because he can't force you to do anything. If we think about what Charlie had mentioned and what Lance had mentioned, he can't take the pitchfork and do what with it? Just kind of keep poking you to do something. He can't do that. He's got to make you be the one to make the decision. So how does he do that? It's really simple. Yeah. He's scheming, and because we understand, and the Scriptures reveal that he's powerful, we never ought to underestimate him. John chapter 8, verse 44, what famous statement is made about Satan? He's not only the father of lies, but we kind of miss this in John 8:44, and I'll admit, maybe when I say we, I really mean I. I do bring up John 8:44 a lot because he's the father of lies. But what else is he? A murderer. Think about this in the opposite. What is God here to give? John 10:10, you've got Jesus as a good shepherd. I'm here to give life, and I'm here to give it more abundantly, to give life and to give it more abundantly. Satan, the exact opposite. So 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 44, in order for him to do the work that he does, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, what can he do? What capability does he possess? He's able to disguise himself as an angel of light. And in Ephesians 6, verse 12, we've already read that, because he is in this spiritual warfare. And think about spiritual warfare in this sense. The battlefield is in my heart. Because remember, he's got to make me do what? He's got to make me decide to do whatever it is that I do, or don't do something that I should do. He's the one that's got to make me decide to do that. So, by very definition, what kind of battle is it? It's a spiritual battle. And all of the people, and I brought up, and so let me go back to this now. I brought up 22 years ago about Muslims who believed that, they brought this war to the United States because they believed that it was their duty, as given by Muhammad, to kill people who disagree, who were infidels. Have people operating under the name of Christ always been better? No. What have they done? I mean, in recent memory, just within the last 30 or 40 years, bombed abortion clinics, murdered abortion doctors, I think, at least one or two instances. And what else throughout the thousands, 1100s, and 1200s? The Crusades, where a lot of, we talked about God bringing the deaths to a lot of people this morning for good reason. What were the Crusades for? Launched by the Catholic Church. What were they for? To try to wrest control of the Holy Land from Muslims. And many, many people died. For what? For what? Yeah, just basically power and control. Not for spiritual motives. Now, why could we confidently say that? They weren't converting anybody. And let's just think about the real issue at hand. The land means... But spiritually, the land means nothing. Now, on earth, it meant a lot, a whole lot. But spiritually, it didn't mean anything. So that this whole thing goes about, or as spiritual means, for nothing. No benefit whatsoever. I can't condone, I can't stand up here and preach by faith that was right to do. I know my warfare, and I know where it comes from. It's something that's spiritual. It's fought in my mind all of the time. I won't necessarily say every day, because surely a Christian isn't going to fight maybe this spiritual battle every single day. But they fight it a lot. They fight it a lot to do good. This is what Satan does. He tries to make us decide to do evil. So 2 Timothy 2, verse 26, let's just mention that before we move on. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 26. So what does it say? Second Timothy 2, verse 26. Okay, how do you take them captive to do His will? How do you take them captive to do His will? This is important. I mean, it's important to understand it. Think about Moses in Hebrews 11. What did he have to turn away from? The passing pleasures of sin. How does Satan captivate the heart? Yeah, by those three areas. And what were those three areas? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And in each one of those three elements, it can produce a lot of, thinking about Hebrews 11 verse 24, it can produce a lot of happiness. But Hebrews 11:24 also adds that the happiness is only what? It's only fleeting. Okay, so it's going to go away. What would be, someone give me an example of this, of the passing pleasures of sin. I think about, don't ask me why, I think about shoplifting. One of the first crimes that a young person gets involved in is, guess what? Shoplifting. It would be shocking to you, of all of the young people that I've known who are Christians who have shoplifted. It just is. It feels like the most random thing to me. I mean, I didn't do it, but there's lots of people who shoplift. So you sneak something in your jacket and you walk out, and what's that feeling that you have? You got away with it. You're nervous as all get out, but you make it out the door, and what's the feeling that you have? You're just euphoric. I mean, you did it. You pulled it off until the squad car comes kind of screech. They don't screech anymore, ABS and stuff. They all put that on in the shows and stuff. But here comes the squad car, and then what happens to you? You've got a lot of so for whatever you shoplifted, however many dollars it is, I can guarantee you it's many, many hundreds of times that more when it's all said and done. But it's that euphoric feeling. And how long does it last if you get caught? Probably just a few minutes. And then it's done. You got this record now on you that you've got to live with. This is what Satan does. And he only gets better. If someone shoplifts, I'd say probably the average person that I would know, the young person that I would know, that parents would talk to me about, 14 years old, 15 years old. It only gets worse from there. The temptations only get stronger. The joy from them only get more intense. The pressure of acceptance of doing that among your friends only scales up, up, up. He knows what he's doing. He's just absolutely an expert at it. And the only way that I can overcome it is by being, hardened just like a what? Just like a soldier. Okay, so let's kind of go on a little bit. How do we deal with this? Again, what kind of battle is it? It's a spiritual battle. So the point is, the Lord doesn't leave us alone, of course. If it's a spiritual battle, I know that sin is so often an action like shoplifting, but that shoplifting, of course, begins where? In the mind, usually in some young person's decision to do it. No telling what makes them make that decision, but it's still a decision. So what do I have to try to work against that? If I'm trying to fight this spiritual battle in my mind, well then of course what kind of weapons am I going to be given? I'm going to be given, if I got to fight a spiritual temptation, I'm going to be given spiritual weapons. So what does a soldier normally have? What are they issued that helps them in battle? What are they given? Usually they're given body armor. What else? They're given, I had in mind a current soldier, body armor. What else are they given? Usually a gun, grenades. Yes, they're also given lots of very specific training. Because those weapons are complex, to say the least. So you've got to have training in order to be able to use them and to be effective. What weapons do we have? Or can you think of a good place that would illustrate the weapons that we have? We've already turned to Ephesians chapter 6, and we read 12. What starts in the next verse? The armor of God, our weapons. So the first one up is a belt of what? Is a belt of truth. So the belt, now we've got to go back in time to the soldier of Paul's day. What did the belt do? And maybe to an extent, the belt still does the same in a real world sense, slightly different, but still very, very useful. What does a belt do back then? It would not only bind the garment, but then what else? It'd be a convenient place for the swords, and really for any kind of weapon that you would have. Fast forward to today, well, what's the belt have? It's got, really, it's got everything. Because you've got not only your gun, but you're going to have extra ammunition. You're going to have what else? You're going to have provisions on that belt. The belt just got everything. And so it's really interesting that the belt begins with what? The belt of what? The belt of truth. I cannot fight a spiritual enemy without what? Because if I try it, what's going to happen every time? What's going to happen every time? Yeah, I'm going to just fail. If I don't have the belt of truth to begin my spiritual battle, it's just not going to work. Secondly, there was a breastplate. And what was that breastplate? Of righteousness. What did the breastplate do? Okay, protected the body. So what is righteousness? Righteousness is a larger term. It's a little bit more exclusive of a term. If you'll allow me, we talked about this in our class on Wednesday night. We were looking at homosexuality, and we were bringing up the difference between the term fornication or sexual immorality that a lot of you have in your Bibles, and adultery. So one is a much larger term. Adultery is a subset of that much larger term. Righteousness is kind of one of those bigger terms. So what all do you think righteousness would have included in it? Yeah. Yeah, and and in righteousness in the book of Romans, someone asked a question through the website. We get questions like this all the time. And this person is talking about the righteousness of God and the righteousness of God being imputed to man. This is what his question's about. In the sense of Romans chapter 10, the righteousness of God is not God's holiness being put into my heart. The righteousness of God is the whole grand scheme of how any of us can be saved. So if I'm going to follow the righteousness of God, then I will have to pull some of His qualities like integrity and uprightness and godliness and the kind of peace that God can give. And I'm going to pull those, and I'm going to act in a righteous way. And that's God's plan, His provision for making all of us righteous. So Paul pictures the breastplate of righteousness, one that is going to make it really hard to penetrate, as a little bit later on in the text says, penetrate with what? The fiery darts of the wicked one. If you can fill your heart with righteousness, and it makes it more difficult to what? To do unrighteousness. You fill your heart with righteousness, it makes it more difficult to sin. Not impossible, because all of us have known, all of us hopefully have tried to be really righteous people in the past, and yet we'll still do things that we know we shouldn't. Or we've known people really, really righteous, and yet we know their lives, and we know that they still do things that, again, that they shouldn't, and hopefully that they'll change and not do. But the breastplate of righteousness makes it much, much more difficult. Next up were shoes. Shoes. Feet shod with what? With the preparation of the gospel. Roman soldiers had shoes that had spikes in them. Going back to an athlete, I think we mentioned it in one of our classes. If you're going to run on a track, unless your athletic director doesn't like this, you're usually going to have shoes with what? With spikes. You go to Academy, they've got track spikes there. And what do the spikes do? They give you traction. And when your feet, and Roman soldiers had shoes that had spikes in them for the footing that they needed. So how can my feet being shod with the gospel help me? How can it help me? Yeah, I like that. Those ideas that you guys, they ground me. They help keep me stable. And I have that grounding. I have that stability through understanding of it. First of all, through knowledge of it, through understanding of it, and then, maybe more importantly than anything, one more time, the decision to actually follow it. Because everyone's got decisions. We get the knowledge. You're sitting here. You're learning the knowledge. You're absorbing it. It just becomes a matter, can I decide to do it? Can I help my kids decide to do it? Can I help them be disciples? So feet are shod with the preparation of the gospel. We also have, of course, the shield. Back in the Roman days, how big was the shield? It was actually a big full body shield. Well, of course, what's the shield fight off? Arrows, the impact of that weapon, probably from swords as well. What is my shield? Faith. Faith. So what does faith help me knock out? The fiery darts. And what are some of those fiery darts? So now let's talk about what the fiery darts are. Temptation's one of them, yes. But is that the only fiery dart that Satan possesses? Well, you know the next question. What is it? What are some of these darts that aren't temptation? Fear, doubt, worry, anxiety. They're all fiery darts. What can help me from giving into it? Faith can. I don't mean, it's not like it's going to just keep it from ever entering my mind. It's going to enter my mind. I just can't give into it. Okay, Lance, sorry, go ahead.
The shields of Roman times as well, they would collectively put them together to create a stronger defense. They called it the turtle. And they would butt them up next to each other. So collectively, other soldiers with their shields could protect the group and be a stronger force against the foe.
Interestingly, the one who conceived of that, as far as I understand, was Alexander the Great's father, Philip of Macedon. And he created kind of this phalanx where all of the shields would touch one another. And that is one of the reasons why Alexander the Great could go and conquer the world. He was using a technique at the time that no one else was using. Incredibly effective. That's what you need to take away. Incredibly effective when we've got each other. Okay, thanks everyone for your comments.